Before we descend into the shadows that blanketed the city of Philadelphia, a quick reminder. The tale you are about to read is a journey into the heart of calculated madness, a puzzle pieced together with fragments of forgotten art and human lives. It is a story designed to linger long after you've finished the last word. If you appreciate deep, immersive storytelling that explores the darkest corners of the human psyche, please consider subscribing for more content like this. Your support allows these stories to be told. Now take a deep breath. Let us begin. The city of Philadelphia was sweating through an unforgiving August heat wave, the air thick and stagnant, clinging to the skin like a shroud. For Detective Miles Corbin, the heat was a physical manifestation of the city's mood. Oppressive, suffocating, and ripe for violence. But nothing could have prepared him for the scene that awaited him in the elegant, high-ceilinged dining room of a Rittenhouse Square brownstone. The call had come in as a wellness check. An elderly, wealthy couple, the Vanderbilts, hadn't been heard from in 3 days. The responding officers had found the front door unlocked. They had found the family first. Corbin ducked under the yellow tape, the familiar scent of iron and decay hitting him like a physical blow, cutting through the cloying sweetness of potpourri. His partner, Detective Isabella Rossi, stood by the doorway, her face pale and set. She was a good cop, grounded and pragmatic, a perfect anchor for Corbin's often drifting, intuitive mind. "Miles," she said, her voice low, "brace yourself. This isn't just a murder. This is a statement." Corbin stepped inside, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. The Vanderbilts, Harold and Genevieve, were seated at their grand mahogany dining table. They were dressed in their finest evening wear, Harold in a tuxedo, Genevieve in a beaded gown. Their 20-something son, Thomas, sat with them, a silk bow tie perfectly knotted at his neck. A fourth place was set, but empty. They were all dead. But it was the how they were arranged that stole the breath from Corbin's lungs. They weren't slumped or sprawled in the grotesque postures of violent death. They were posed. Harold was lifting a wine glass to his lips, a gentle, serene smile etched onto his face. Genevieve was offering a piece of bread on a fork towards her son's mouth, her head tilted with maternal affection. Thomas was reaching for it, his expression one of placid acceptance. They looked like a photograph from a 1950s society magazine, a perfect family frozen in a perfect moment. A family of mannequins, except for the dullness in their eyes, the subtle, unnatural stiffness of their limbs, the fine, almost invisible filaments of wire that ran from their joints to discrete anchor points on the ceiling and walls, holding them in their flawless, impossible poses. "The coroner is on his way," Rossi said, her voice a strained whisper. "No obvious cause of death. No blood, no gunshot wounds, no signs of a struggle. The house isn't tossed. Valuables are all here. It's like they just sat down for dinner and stopped." Corbin moved slowly around the table, his eyes, the color of a stormy sea, taking in every impossible detail. He wasn't a typical homicide detective. He held a master's degree in art history, a past life he'd abandoned for the brutal certainty of police work. He saw things differently. He didn't just see a crime scene, he saw a composition. "He's an artist, is he?" Corbin murmured, his gaze fixed on the delicate curl of Mrs. Vanderbilt's fingers. "This isn't about rage or profit. This is about control. Absolute control." He pointed to the way the wires were attached, not crudely, but with the precision of a master puppeteer. "Look at the tension in the lines. He understands anatomy. He understands weight distribution. He posed them post-mortem, but it must have been soon after. Rigor mortis hasn't fully set in this way." He leaned closer to the table, his nostrils flaring. Beneath the smell of death, there was something else. Faint, almond-like. Cyanide? No, something more subtle. The press dubbed him the marionette within 24 hours. The city was gripped by a unique kind of terror. This wasn't the work of a frenzied slasher or a cold-blooded gangster. This was the work of a ghost, a silent, meticulous predator who could walk into your home, end your life without a whisper, and turn your family into a macabre work of art. The toxicology reports confirmed Corbin's suspicions. The Vanderbilts had been killed by a highly concentrated, fast-acting paralytic agent derived from a rare Amazonian frog. It would have induced total muscle paralysis within seconds, followed by respiratory failure. It was painless, silent, and terrifyingly efficient. It was introduced into their evening wine. The killer had been in the house with them, perhaps even dining with them at that empty fourth-place setting. Weeks bled into a month. The heat broke, but the chill of fear remained. The marionette was silent. The leads dried up. The city began to breathe again, hoping the Vanderbilt tableau was a singular, nightmarish anomaly. Then came the second performance. It was in the dusty, forgotten stacks of the University of Pennsylvania's rare book library. A graduate student, a brilliant young historian named Anya Sharma, was found in a small, private study corral. She was posed sitting in a chair, a leather-bound 16th-century manuscript open on her lap. Her head was bowed in concentration, one delicate hand raised to her temple as if lost in deep thought. A pair of antique reading glasses were perched on her nose. She looked like a classical sculpture. The scholar, the same MO, the same paralytic poison, this time in her thermos of tea. The same invisible wires holding her in a pose of serene, eternal study. Corbin stood in the hushed, cavernous library, the air thick with the smell of aging paper and death. This time there was something new, a detail that made the hair on his arms stand up. Propped against a bookshelf behind the victim was a small, postcard-sized print of a painting, the Allegory of Study by the Dutch master Johannes Vermeer. The pose was identical. The killer wasn't just creating scenes. He was recreating art. "He's evolving," Corbin said to Rossi, his voice tight. "He's showing off his knowledge." The Vanderbilt scene. It was a genre piece, a domestic idol. This is a direct historical reference. He's trying to educate us. He's telling us how smart he is. Rossi ran a hand through her dark hair. Or he's just a psycho who likes to play with bodies and has a library card. "No," Corbin insisted, his eyes scanning the room. "It's more than that. The choice of victim, the location, the pose, they're all connected." Anya Sharma was researching the societal impact of the Black Death, a time of immense, uncontrollable chaos. He poses her in an image of perfect, quiet contemplation. He's creating order out of chaos. That's his obsession. The task force ballooned. The FBI sent profilers. The media frenzy was relentless. The marionette was no longer just a local horror. He was a national phenomenon, a modern-day Jack the Ripper with a flair for the dramatic. Corbin found himself retreating further into his own world, the world of art and history he thought he had left behind. He spent his nights not in bars, but in his small apartment, surrounded by stacks of art books, searching for a pattern, a signature, a school of thought that could link these horrific masterpieces. He felt a strange, terrifying connection to the killer. He understood the aesthetic, the cold pursuit of perfection. The marionette was speaking a language of composition and symbolism, and Corbin was horrified to find he was one of the few people who could understand it. The third scene appeared 2 weeks later and shattered what little composure Corbin had left. A city sanitation worker, a man named Frank Miller, was found in a grimy alley in South Philly. He was posed standing, leaning on his push-broom, his body forming a graceful S-curve, his head tilted towards the rising sun. He was a perfect replica of The Sower, the famous painting by Jean-Francois Millet, but instead of sowing seeds in a field, he was surrounded by trash and urban decay. The juxtaposition was breathtakingly cynical. The message was clear. Beauty can be imposed anywhere on anyone. Class, wealth, location, none of it mattered. The marionette was the artist. The rest of the world was just his clay. Corbin stood in that foul-smelling alley, the city's morning hustle-bustle a distant hum. Rossi was talking to him, but her voice was muffled, as if coming from underwater. His focus was entirely on a small detail. Tucked into the deceased's pocket was a single, perfectly preserved starling feather. It was clean, iridescent, and utterly out of place. It meant nothing to anyone else. a random piece of detritus from the street. But to Corbin, it was a thunderclap. Years ago, in his academic life, he had published a paper in an obscure art history journal. It was a dense, theoretical piece about the use of avian symbolism in 19th-century French realist paintings. In one footnote, he had focused on Millet's work, specifically theorizing that a barely visible bird in the background of The Sower was a starling, representing the common man's resilience. The paper had been read by maybe 50 people in the entire world. The marionette was one of them. He wasn't just creating art. He wasn't just showing off. He had chosen this specific, obscure reference for a reason. He was sending a message directly to Detective Miles Corbin. The performance wasn't for the city or the police or the media anymore. It was for an audience of one. The starling feather changed everything. It was no longer a case. It was a conversation, a twisted dialogue between two minds operating on a plane others couldn't see. Corbin didn't share his discovery with the task force. How could he? The killer is a fan of my graduate school thesis? They'd think he was cracking under the pressure, his ego making phantom connections. Even Rossi, who trusted him implicitly, would struggle to see it as anything more than a grim coincidence. So he held it close, a cold, dark secret that coiled in his gut. The hunt was now personal. Corbin's life dissolved into a singular, obsessive focus. His apartment became a chaotic war room, the walls plastered with crime scene photos, maps of Philadelphia, and reproductions of hundreds of paintings, from Renaissance portraits to modern abstracts. He slept in 2-hour increments, haunted by dreams of galleries where the paintings watched him back with dead eyes. He lived on black coffee and the nervous energy of the chase. He was no longer just a detective. He was a student, and the marionette was his ruthless professor. Corbin retraced his own academic footsteps, pulling his old notes from dusty boxes, rereading the obscure texts he had once studied. He was searching for another link, another clue hidden in the footnotes of his own past. The killer knew his work, which meant the killer had access to academic databases, university libraries, or he was part of that world himself. Rossi watched her partner's descent with growing alarm. The vibrant, if melancholic, man she knew was being replaced by a gaunt, hollow-eyed specter. "You need to sleep, Miles," she'd say, placing a container of food on his cluttered desk that he would never touch. "The team is working the case. You don't have to carry it all yourself." "He's not talking to the team, is he?" Corbin would reply, not looking up from a 17th century treatise on anatomical drawing. "He's talking to me. I just have to figure out what he's trying to say." Meanwhile, the city held its breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop. The marionette's silence was more terrifying than his actions. The invisible threat lingered in the autumn air, a miasma of fear that made people lock their doors earlier, eye strangers with suspicion, and see artistic poses in the way a homeless man slept on a bench. The breakthrough, when it came, was from an unexpected source. A small, anonymous tip was called into the hotline. The caller, a man with a raspy, nervous voice, said he'd seen something strange a few weeks back, around the time the sanitation worker was killed. He'd seen a vintage, dark green panel van, the kind used by florists or antique dealers, parked near the alley in the pre-dawn hours. He hadn't thought much of it then, but the news reports kept nagging at him. He gave a partial license plate number. It was a sliver of a lead, but it was more than they'd had in weeks. The team went to work, cross-referencing DMV records with business licenses for antique restorers, art handlers, and specialty craftsmen. The list was long, a tedious slog through mountains of data. While the team chased the van, Corbin followed his own path. He believed the key was in the killer's psychology. The progression of the art was crucial. First, a generic domestic scene. Then, a specific art history reference. Then, a reference aimed directly at Corbin. What was the logical next step in this horrifying curriculum? The answer, he feared, was a lesson in intimacy. The killer would want to close the distance, to prove he could touch Corbin's world directly. The fourth tableau was found on a crisp October morning. The victim was a young beat cop named Officer Miller, a fresh-faced kid Corbin had mentored briefly at the academy. He was found in a small city park, posed on a bench, his hand outstretched as if feeding pigeons that weren't there. He was dressed in his uniform, his face a mask of peaceful contentment. The scene was a haunting echo of a famous photograph of a man on a park bench, an icon of simple, everyday tranquility. But this time the wires were gone. Miller's body was held in its pose by a complex, internal armature of metal rods and joints, a gruesome subcutaneous puppetry. The killer had dissected and re-engineered the body from the inside out. The level of surgical precision required was astounding. The marionette's art had evolved from external manipulation to internal reconstruction. He was no longer just a puppeteer, he was the creator. Corbin felt a wave of nausea and rage so profound it almost brought him to his knees. This was the killer's new message to him. You are failing. I can get to your people, the very fabric of your world, and you can't stop me. And my craft is only getting more perfect. The death of an officer sent a shockwave through the department. The hunt for the marionette became a crusade. The commissioner reamed out the task force, demanding results. The pressure on Corbin was immense. He was the expert, the one who was supposed to understand this monster. And he had failed to protect one of his own. The grief and guilt gnawed at him, but he forced it down, channeling it into cold, sharp focus. He stood over Miller's desecrated body in the morgue, forcing himself to look at the horrifying surgical work. This wasn't the work of an amateur. This required a deep, practical knowledge of anatomy, taxidermy, or a related field. It was then that the lead on the green van paid off. After chasing down hundreds of dead ends, they found a match. A 1980s panel van, registered to a small business in a dilapidated part of the Fishtown neighborhood. Croft and Son, Artisanal Restoration. The business had officially closed years ago, but the property was still owned by the family trust. The sole remaining family member was a man named Julian Croft. The name meant nothing to Corbin, but when they pulled up Croft's file, a detail made his blood run cold. Julian Croft had attended the University of Pennsylvania for 2 years, pursuing a graduate degree in art history before dropping out. The same department Corbin had been a part of. They descended on the address, a 3-story brick workshop wedged between a derelict warehouse and a row of boarded-up homes. The building was dark, the windows grimy and opaque. A SWAT team took positions, their weapons trained on the silent facade. Corbin and Rossi stood back, the tension a living thing in the air. "This is it, Miles," Rossi said, her hand resting on her sidearm. "We got him." But Corbin felt a prickle of doubt. Felt too easy. The marionette was a meticulous planner, a ghost. Would he really be so careless as to use a van registered to his own name? The SWAT team breached the door with a battering ram, the sound echoing down the empty street. They poured inside, shouting commands into the darkness. Corbin and Rossi followed, their flashlights cutting through the gloom. The ground floor was a workshop, but a workshop from a nightmare. It was filled with antique mannequins, anatomical models, and half-finished sculptures. The air was thick with the chemical smells of solvents, plaster, and something else. Formaldehyde. On a large table in the center of the room lay a collection of surgical tools, gleaming under the tactical lights. Wires and metal rods of all sizes were neatly organized on the wall. This was the laboratory, but Julian Croft wasn't there. The team cleared the building, floor by floor. It was empty, but on the top floor, in what must have been a living space, they found his studio. And in the center of the studio, a new tableau. It was a mockery of the police investigation. 5 life-sized mannequins, dressed as police officers, were gathered around a large table. On the table were maps and photos from the actual marionette case file-leaked images. The mannequins were posed in expressions of frustration and confusion. One held its head in its hands. Another pointed an accusatory finger at another. And in the center of the table, propped up on a small easel, was a single, freshly printed photo. It was a surveillance shot, taken from a distance, of Detective Miles Corbin standing in the alley over the body of the sanitation worker. Circled in red ink was the starling feather in the victim's pocket. Beneath it, a single line was typed on a piece of paper. I thought you, of all people, would appreciate the nuance. Are you not enjoying our little exhibition? He had been watching them. He knew they were coming. He had prepared this entire scene, this taunt, just for them. He had wanted them to find this place. It was a deliberate misdirection, another move in his elaborate game. Corbin stared at the photograph of himself, a cold dread seeping into his bones. The marionette wasn't just a killer he was hunting. The marionette was hunting him, too. He was drawing Corbin deeper and deeper into his world, isolating him, making him a part of the performance. He looked around the studio. It was obsessively neat. Books on art, anatomy, and philosophy were perfectly shelved. On a small desk, a laptop was open. A forensics tech was already working on it. "Detective," the tech called out. "You need to see this." Corbin and Rossi moved to the desk. The screen showed an open document. It was a detailed biography, a life story. But it wasn't the killer's. It was Corbin's. It had everything. His birthplace, his education, his short-lived academic career, his reasons for joining the police force. It detailed his failed marriage, his estranged relationship with his father, his recurring nightmares about a childhood incident he'd never told anyone about. The marionette hadn't just read his academic paper. He had dissected Corbin's entire life. He knew every strength, every weakness, every secret fear. And at the very bottom of the document was a final, chilling sentence. The discovery in Julian Croft's workshop sent the task force into a frenzy. But for Miles Corbin, it was a moment of terrifying clarity. He was no longer the hunter. He was the prey, meticulously studied and understood by his predator. The workshop wasn't a lair. It was a stage, and they had all played their parts exactly as the marionette had intended. Julian Croft was a ghost, a name attached to a past, but the man himself was gone, dissolved back into the city's shadows. While the forensic teams dismantled the workshop, searching for a stray fingerprint or a strand of DNA, Corbin retreated. He didn't go back to his chaotic apartment. He went to the one place that felt like an anchor to his past, the place where this all began, the university library. He needed to understand the man, not just his crimes. Who was Julian Croft? The file was thin. A brilliant, solitary student who had been a prodigy in the art restoration program before switching to art history. His parents, both renowned puppeteers and artisans, had died in a tragic house fire when he was a teenager. He had inherited the family workshop and a small fortune, then vanished from academic life after 2 years. He had no friends, no social media, no footprint in the modern world. He was a man out of time. Corbin sat in a dusty corral, the same kind where Anya Sharma had been found, and pulled up the old records from the fire. The report was standard. Faulty wiring in the workshop. The parents died of smoke inhalation. The teenage son, Julian, was pulled from the flames by a firefighter, suffering only minor burns. Case closed. But Corbin, now trained to see the composition in chaos, read between the lines. He looked at the crime scene photos from the fire, the way his father's tools were laid out, the position of his mother's half-finished marionettes. Something about the accidental scene felt wrong, felt staged. It was a nascent impulse, a primitive version of the art he would later perfect. A thought, cold and sharp, pierced through Corbin's exhaustion. He wasn't a victim of the fire. He was its author. He hadn't lost control. He had seized it for the first time, preserving his parents from the messy unpredictability of life, turning a chaotic accident into his first, private masterpiece. That was the key. The marionette wasn't just recreating famous art. He was recreating his own life, but correcting it. The Vanderbilt family dinner? A twisted homage to the family dinners he never had. The scholar in the library? A version of the academic life he abandoned. The common man in the alley? A nod to the ordinary people he watched from the fringes of society. And Officer Miller? A symbol of the authority he despised, posed in serene submission. Everything was a piece of his own fractured autobiography. And Corbin, with his own haunted past and his academic understanding of symbolism, was the only person who could read it. The marionette didn't just want an audience. He wanted a biographer, a confessor. And the final piece, the self-portrait, required a model who could understand the artist. Corbin now knew where to go. The final performance would not be in a random location. It had to be a place of personal significance to Julian, a place of grand drama, a place where art and life and death converged, a place where he could control the stage completely. He looked at the old Croft family file again. His parents hadn't just been puppeteers. They had been the resident artists and caretakers for a grand, old theater that had fallen into disuse, the Orpheum Grand. It had been shuttered for decades, a magnificent Beaux-Arts palace slowly decaying in the heart of the city. According to the property records, it was still owned by a city trust, but the Croft family had been the last legal tenants. Julian would have known every secret passage, every dusty corner. It was his childhood home, his stage. Corbin didn't call for the SWAT team. He knew Julian would be waiting for him, and for him alone. Bringing an army would only result in a bloodbath, or worse, Julian would simply disappear, his masterpiece spoiled. This was a duet. He went to Rossi. He laid out his theory, the fire, the theater, the horrifying personal connection. He saw the doubt in her eyes warring with her trust in him. "This is insane, Miles," she said. "You're walking into his kill zone." "He doesn't want to kill me, is he?" Corbin said, his voice eerily calm. "Not yet. He wants me to see, to understand. That's the whole point of the performance." "And after you understand?" Corbin had no answer. He gave her the address. "Give me 1 hour. If you don't hear from me, then bring the cavalry. But please, give me the hour." She reluctantly agreed, her eyes filled with a fear he hadn't seen before. The Orpheum Grand loomed like a mausoleum against the bruised twilight sky. Corbin pushed open the heavy oak doors, which swung inward with a groan of protest. The air inside was cold and dead, thick with the dust of forgotten decades. The vast lobby was lit by a single, bare bulb hanging from the frescoed ceiling, casting long, dancing shadows. In the center of the room, on a velvet divan, sat a new creation. It was a woman, posed with a book in her lap, her head tilted as if listening for a sound. It took Corbin a moment to recognize the face of the librarian, Anya Sharma, perfectly recreated on a custom-made mannequin. He walked past it, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous space, and entered the main theater. The sight stole his breath. The entire stage was set. Under the ghostly glow of the old stage lights, which Julian had somehow restored, was his grand finale. In the center was a perfect replica of the Vanderbilt's dining table, with the 3 figures posed exactly as they had been. To the left, a figure of the sanitation worker leaned on his broom. To the right, the police officer sat on a park bench. They were all there, his past works, assembled for a retrospective. They were not the real bodies, but hyper-realistic sculptures, each one a testament to his terrifying skill. And in the very center of the stage, in the seat of honor at the head of the dining table, was an empty chair. The empty place setting from the very first crime scene. "Breathtaking, isn't it?" The voice came from the darkness of the orchestra pit. It was calm, cultured, and devoid of any discernible emotion. A man emerged, climbing the stairs to the stage. He was of average height and build, with pale skin and neat, dark hair. He wore the simple, practical clothes of a craftsman. He could have been anyone. It was Julian Croft. "To see them all together," Julian continued, gesturing to his creations. "It gives the work a sense of cohesion. A narrative arc, don't you agree, detective?" "It's over, Julian," Corbin said, his voice steady, his hand near his weapon. Julian smiled, a thin, bloodless expression. "Over? My dear detective, it has just begun. This is the culmination. I have spent my life running from the vulgar chaos of reality, the clumsiness, the unpredictability. In my work, I create perfection. I take a messy, fleeting human life, and I distill it into a single, perfect, eternal moment. I'm not a destroyer. I am a preserver." He walked over to the empty chair. "I have followed your career for years, Miles. Ever since I read your paper. You see the world as I do. You see the patterns, the composition. You see the art in the horror. All this was for you. My magnum opus needed a critic who could truly appreciate it. These were people, Julian, Corbin said, taking a slow step forward. They had lives, families, futures. And now they have immortality, Julian countered, his voice rising with passion. They are free from sickness, from aging, from heartbreak. They are perfect. I gave them a gift. He gestured to the empty chair again. This is my final piece. The artist, at last, taking his place within his own creation. A self-portrait. But my hands are an artist's hands. They are not suited for the crude work of preparation. For that, one needs a model, a template. It was then that Corbin saw it. In the shadows behind the set, a figure was strapped to a chair, hidden from view until now. It was Rossi. She was gagged and unconscious. I'm afraid your partner was a bit too predictable, Julian said, his voice losing its artistic detachment, replaced by a cold edge. Following you here, so sentimental, but she will serve as the perfect vessel. A portrait of loyalty. The choice was laid bare. Corbin was to be the final model, posed forever as the critic, while Rossi became another masterpiece beside him. You're wrong, Julian, Corbin said, his mind racing. He had one chance, not with his gun, but with his words. He had to dismantle the artist's philosophy. You think this is perfection? This is a lie. It's a monument to your own fear. You didn't preserve your parents. You murdered them because you couldn't control them. Julian's calm facade fractured. A flicker of rage crossed his face. They were going to leave, to sell the workshop, this theater, to abandon everything. I perfected them. I kept them here with me. And you've been doing it ever since, Corbin pressed, taking another step. Every victim is a substitute for them. A substitute for the control you lost. But look at your work, Julian. Really look at it. It's flawed. Flawed. Julian hissed the word an insult. It is perfect. No, Corbin said, pointing to the Vanderbilt tableau. The wine glass. In the original crime scene, Harold Vanderbilt's pinky finger was extended. A small affectation of the upper class. Here, in your sculpture, his hand is clenched. It's a small detail, but you missed it. For a man obsessed with perfection, it's a glaring mistake, isn't it? Julian's eyes darted to the sculpture. He saw the tiny flaw Corbin had invented. For a moment, his entire world, built on the foundation of absolute control and perfection, wavered. His focus shifted from Corbin and Rossi to his own perceived failure. It was the opening Corbin needed. He lunged, not at Julian, but at a heavy stage light on a rolling stand. He shoved it with all his might. It crashed into the Vanderbilt dining table, shattering the sculpture of Harold, the centerpiece of Julian's collection. The sound of plaster and wood shattering echoed like a gunshot. Julian screamed, a raw, animal sound of pure agony, not for himself, but for his ruined art. That primal scream was his undoing. It was the chaos he had spent his life trying to escape. He lunged at Corbin with a scalpel that seemed to appear from nowhere. The two men fell to the stage, a clumsy, desperate brawl. All of Julian's cold precision gone, replaced by frantic rage. It wasn't a battle of wits anymore. It was a fight for survival. In the struggle, the scalpel clattered away. Julian's hands went for Corbin's throat, his artist's fingers surprisingly strong. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the theater. Julian's body went rigid. The pressure on Corbin's throat vanished. A small, dark hole appeared on Julian's chest. He looked down at it, a look of profound surprise on his face, before slumping sideways onto the stage. Corbin looked up, gasping for air. Rossi was standing at the edge of the stage, her hands shaking, her service weapon still smoking. She had managed to free one hand from her bonds. Silence descended upon the Orpheum Grand, broken only by Corbin's ragged breaths. The great performance was over. The audience was gone. All that remained were the broken puppets and the silence of the stage. Weeks later, the city was still processing the horrors of the marionette. But for Miles Corbin, the silence was the most haunting part. He had walked into the mind of a monster and come back, but he had left something of himself behind in the darkness. He stood before a painting in the Philadelphia Museum of Art, a quiet landscape by a Dutch master. He used to see beauty, technique, history. Now he just saw the wires,